thanks for for coming this morning, and thanks for everyone who might be out there. Is this live or not live? Doesn't matter. So today I will be talking about hands-free full arm gesture interaction and beyond, what might lay beyond. So luckily I prepared my own little introduction. No, Neil did a really good job. So I completed my diploma in informatics at the University of Darmstadt back a while ago in Darmstadt in Germany. After that, I moved to the beautiful prairies and completed my PhD in human-computer interaction at the University of Saskatchewan with under the supervision of Dr. Carl Goodwin. And now I am finally here, back in civilization, back to a slightly more crowded place, back in Ontario at the University of Waterloo. I'm working here at the James Institute with Dr. Mark Hancock as a postdoctoral research fellow. So this is kind of interaction of the cables. The domains of interaction techniques, video games, gamification, and computer-supported collaborative work, or CSCW in short, are kind of my research interests. And the area I've been working on for my dissertation is pretty much the interaction techniques and the cross-section of interaction techniques and CSCW. What I want to talk about today, however, is moving the domain of interaction techniques, or moving my research in the domain of interaction techniques a little bit more into video games and gamification. But for now, firstly, let me just quickly explain why I started, or where my interest in research of interaction techniques, where it actually originated and where it kind of came from. So I'm a computer scientist. All my degrees are in computer science, so obviously I do love technology. What people might not know about me is, though, that I also like cooking and baking. Woohoo! So picture this, if you will. Much like this woman on the screen, I use technology to keep track of, for example, my recipes. But unlike this kind of promotional photo suggested, interaction with technology while I am baking or while I'm cooking is actually quite difficult. For example, how would you scroll through your recipes or through images while your hands are dirty after you just cut up some chicken, or after your hands are wet while you just cut some lettuce? And I know you might say, well, who cares about you and your baking? It's kind of a weird niche problem. I don't think it's actually that much of a niche problem, and I think it can affect much more than just me being unhappy about my experience in the kitchen. So think, for example, operating theaters. Operating theaters these days are equipped with a bucket load of different imaging technology devices. So you have your built-in CT scans, you have your built-in MSRs, and the surgical team can activate those imaging devices whenever they need it, and then use the images to hopefully not kill the patient, to hopefully do a better job while they're operating on the patient. However, how do you interact with this digital imagery? How do you interact with those images that are projected or that are displayed on those huge screens? Well, you can't obviously touch, or a surgical team obviously can't touch the device because their gloves are sterilized. They're working in what's called sterilized zone, and the device is outside of that zone. So currently, what they do is they have someone doing all the interaction with technology for them. They tell people, oh, can you please show me this, right? Can you please zoom in there? So while this works, it kind of makes operating theaters a little bit crowded. So operating teams in those modern operating theaters are between 12 and 25 people. So it gets full in there, but it's also, of course, a problem because there has to be communication between two people. And that can be a little bit error-prone, especially in situations where you might have some sort of stressful, especially when you might have some stressful situations going on. Like if a surgeon really has to figure out what's going on within the next 2 seconds, communicating with the surgical staff might be a problem. It might just take too much time. Another example might be when people just want to collaborate, let's say in a co-located way, so they're not distributed in different, let's say in different cubicles. No, they're sitting next to each other and they want to communicate about something that might be on the screen, right? We use communication, or when we communicate in a co-located setting, we do use gestures, we do use body language a lot, right? I'm using body language right now, but this type of non-verbal communication plays an important role in how we communicate. And you can imagine that it might be much easier to show something on the screen just by pointing at it than, for example, using a mouse cursor and moving the mouse cursor to the area of interest. Mouse cursors are small, they're really hard to see. Pointing gestures, waving gestures are really obvious. And then, of course, for my final example, sometimes people just are doing things where they're already holding devices in their hands, right? You are in your cave, not your man cave, but you are in your 3D cave. You are in your virtual reality, and you're already holding two devices to interact with that virtual reality. But now imagine you want to do something outside of what you can actually control. Let's imagine you want to change the volume setting. How do you do that without putting down your devices, taking off your virtual reality helmet, making changes, and then changing the volume, adjusting the volume, and then putting everything back on. So again, this is a scenario where you don't want to hold something in your hands, where you want to interact with the system, where you want to change the volume without holding any additional device in your hand. So the solution to all of those four scenarios is essentially hands-free interaction with digital systems. So interacting with digital systems without actually holding or touching any input device. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not really a new idea, and I'm not claiming that I was the first one who thought about that. There are existing commercially available devices that do that. Leap Motion, for example. There are numerous patents that deal with that, or that cover hands-free interaction with digital devices. And there are, of course, experimental devices such as the HoloLens who use gestures to interact with. But the question is, are those gestures, are they the only possible solution? Maybe there are other solutions, maybe there are better solutions. And this is what my research was actually all about. But before I talk about my research, my dissertation research, I want to clarify something. So I said, are these gestures? So that kind of implies that there's some commonality between all of those gestures. And there indeed is. Gestures, or what Ekman and Friesen called nonverbal communication, can be classified, or gestures that are part of nonverbal communication can be classified in different categories. And one of them is called an emblem. So emblems are gestures that translate to one exact and precise meaning. For example, the bloom gesture in the HoloLens just means open the menu. The wavy gesture in the Leap Motion means play a random song. So all of those gestures are really directly connected to one command that is issued to the computer. And as I said, all of those are in the category, or fall into the category of emblem. So for instance, in this non-digital scenario, thumbs up means let's ascend, right? So it's one gesture that has that translates into one direct action. But you might be able to tell, since there's so much negative space, that there are actually different categories of gestures. And I want to talk about those a little bit. Because, well, maybe some of them are actually more suitable for interacting with digital devices than emblems are. So a pretty common gesture that we use in interacting with other people, that we constantly use when we interact with other people, and that I'm doing right now, are called regulators. So regulators are gestures that are used to mitigate flow of conversation, for example, and to accentuate speech, just as Bernie Sanders is doing over there. there are, for example, affect displays. So you can see this woman. This woman is kind of raising her leg to show affection to whoever that guy is. So again, I want to show affection to, let's say, my dad or my uncle, give it a big hug, and raise my leg. Another type of gestures are so-called adapters. Adapters are gestures that we perform to mitigate some bodily needs. So for example, this little fellow on the bottom right, he might have an itchy nose, so he stretches his nose. Britney Spears might be bored for whatever reason, so she is playing around with her pencil. And me, for example, I just biked in 3 kilometers, so I'm a little bit sweaty. So I do this a lot to, to get drier. Right. There are another group of gestures, or another type of gestures, are spatial illustrators. And again, it's a gesture that we commonly use when we want to demonstrate some sort of spatial relationship. For example, the fish I caught was that big. How big was it? This big. So a gesture, nonverbal communication, that illustrates, for instance, the size, right, of, let's say, the fish that guy caught. And then finally, there are directed illustrators. So directed illustrators are gestures that are oftentimes used to, or that oftentimes are used in speech to reference objects that we just talked about. So if I say, well, this picture on the bottom left, then I'm performing a directed illustrator. I augment my speech with a gesture. So this I might be saying, which Eiffel Tower are you talking about? I'm talking about this Eiffel Tower over there. So all of those gestures are, in theory, suitable for interaction with computers, with digital systems. And as I said, the only type of gestures that we have been using in systems so far are emblems. And again, just kind of as a just to explain the difference again a little bit, emblems are gestures that are where the gesture itself contains the meaning, right? This means let's ascend. This means I'm doing all right. Or when I talk about human-computer interaction, this in the context of a HoloLens means show me the start menu. Directed illustrators is not about the gesture that much. It's about what the gesture refers to. It's the referent of the gesture, right? This car, this image, this Gandalf over there, right? This drawing. It's the gesture in combination to what the gesture refers to that gives it its meaning. So in my research, that's what I just said. Meaning is within the gesture, or the meaning is the relationship between the gesture and the referent. So in my research, in my dissertation research, I looked at how we can use directed illustrators to issue commands to digital systems and how that compares with the emblematic gestures that pretty much all systems are currently using. Yes, please.
Didactic illustrators, is pointing the only kind, or are there other kinds that fall into that category?
It is always pointing, however, in quotation marks. So it doesn't mean that you have to point with your finger, and you can say, if I do this, right, that guy over there, that could also be considered a directed illustrator. So it's whenever the idea is it's a directed illustrator whenever you refer, whenever you augment speech to refer to an object that you're already talking about, right? So it could be a nod. I want to say 95% of the cases, and that's just a random number, in most cases, it will be some sort of pointing gesture, right? It doesn't have to be full arm. It could be just like this, or it could just be more casual, saying, yeah, go over there, right? Which way do I have to go to get uptown? And just go over there, right? So it doesn't have to be really a precise pointing gesture, but it's usually a pointing gesture. All good? Perfect. So now the question is, so all these examples are from about how we use nonverbal communication in human communication. Right? So the question is now, how does that translate into communication with digital systems? And we've already seen it with emblems. It can be pretty easy and straightforward, right? You say, well, a certain gesture just means a certain thing, right? So if I do this gesture, for example, it could mean I want to watch CNN. Please, cable box, switch to whatever channel CNN is. In Adapted Illustrators, as I said, it is about what you're pointing at, right? It's not the gesture itself that matters, it's what you're pointing at. So, for example, a pointing gesture toward the window could mean I want to watch CNN. Please, cable box, switch to whatever channel CNN is on. You might have noticed, in both cases, I did the same gesture, right? This gesture means I want to watch CNN. This pointing gesture toward the window means I want to watch CNN, right? So the gesture itself can be physically the same, but we'll figure out that they are cognitively are very, very different. As we will see later, they're cognitively very, very different. So one of the problems, and maybe you kind of you already noticed that, or you already kind of felt it, is how do we talk about emblematic gestures, right? How do I talk about, like this? How do I verbalize that? It's kind of difficult. We don't really have a good way to talk about how we move our body. If you want to learn, for example, if you want to learn how to skate, how would you describe verbally to someone who has never skated before on how skating works, or how spinning a racket when you play tennis works, right? Or how any motion of your body actually works, right? What we usually do is we demonstrate. That's the best way to convey that kind of information. How we describe it, how we verbalize it, that is really difficult. With Adapted Illustrators, it is much easier, right? Because all I have to say is point at the window. And I think everybody here, if I tell them, all you have to do is point at that window, they'll be able to do that right away. So the only question is, how do I know that I have to point at the window in order to watch CNN? Well, this is something where, for instance, mnemonics can be really helpful, right? So pointing at the window is CNN because CNN is my window to the world. Yeah, I guess that kind of works, right? So remembering that CNN, or the command I want to watch CNN, is pointing at the window, is not that difficult once you start remembering that pointing at the window, or CNN is on the window because CNN is my window to the world. So as I said, there are fundamental differences in how people cognitively process emblems versus Adapted Illustrators. It has something to do that they tap into very different parts of human memory. Emblems are tapping much more into motor skills, which are kind of procedural, part of the procedural human memory, and Adapted Illustrators tap much more into relational memory, which is part of the semantic memory system. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but as I said, and as we'll find out later, there are significant differences in the cognitive aspects between those two gestures. Although, as I mentioned before, they might look exactly the same. Physically, they might be the same. Cognitively, they might be very different. So, as I said, or as I hopefully convinced you, it is really difficult to talk about body motions, right? And researchers realized that pretty early on, maybe when they try to explain those gestures to their participants in studies. So they said, well, we have to come up with some sort of a metaphor, right? We can't just tell them, if you want to select CNN, do like this, or that, or higher or lower, or a little bit to the left. This is not a good way to communicate to people, right? This is not a good way to learn what I should do when I use emblems to interact with my digital devices, right? So I think Lee was the first one who came up with this idea of, or this metaphor of virtual shelves. So imagine you're surrounded by virtual, invisible shelves, and all you do is you put all the commands you have. I want to watch CNN, I want to mute my stereo, whatever commands you want to issue, you just put them in different shelves or different racks on your virtual shelf. Then you can think, well, this is on the top left shelf, CNN is on the bottom right shelf, and so on and so forth. So that's just a way, this idea of virtual shelves was a way for researchers to mitigate the problem of not being able to talk about emblems, or of the problem of talking about emblems being really difficult. All right, so I think I talked enough about kind of the background. Now let's look at the actual experiment that I ran. Well, let's talk about that in a second. So I ran an experiment where I implemented a system that is using emblems, and I implemented a system that is using dictate pointing gestures to interact with digital devices. It's pretty much a standard motion tracking system based on infrared cameras. Won't go into too much detail here. There's some maths involved. But what is way more interesting is talking about the results themselves. So what I wanted to figure out is, how do emblems versus illustrators versus dictate illustrators, how do they compare in selection accuracy, selection time, and learnability? So again, just a couple of details about the actual experiment. I'm not going to go into those right for now. But so those are the results, right? I compared emblems with dictate illustrators, and what I found is that people perform both gestures kind of equally well, right? So you have completion time here. Of course, faster is usually better. So illustrators, dictate illustrators, or people who use dictate illustrators were faster than people who used emblems, but none of those differences were significant, right? Which was a bit of a bummer, but well, I looked at, after that I was a little bit disappointed, but then I looked at selection accuracy, and there were huge differences in selection accuracy. Of course, for selection accuracy, higher is always better. Higher is, desired. You want people to accurately do, or people always want the system to respond in a way that they want it to respond. So if you look at selection accuracy, so 50%, just imagine 50% of your interactions with the digital system would result in something that you don't want. That would be devastatingly annoying, right? So illustrators, when people were using illustrators, they performed much better than when people were using emblems. And the question is, of course, why? Why did that happen, right? As I said, there are some cognitive differences, but what exactly was going on here? Sorry. And kind of the answer came to me when I looked at the distribution of errors, right? And distribution of pointing errors. So this is just two simple histograms. So when I look at the pointing errors for emblems, they're kind of all over the place, right? Pointing errors of 90 degrees, it's, you're supposed to point there, but you pointed there. So that's not a mistake. That is not a mistake that you made because you're jittery, or because you were inaccurate, right? It's not a problem of being inaccurate or jittery. It's a problem of really not remembering where things are, right? You have your virtual shelves around you, and you really don't remember where things are, right? Whereas when people were using dictate pointing gestures, so pointing at an object, they were mostly pretty accurate, right? So 0 to 10 degrees, that's jitter. 10 to 20, So this is still people still kind of knew what they were pointing or what they were supposed to point at, and those ones, yeah, they kind of forgot. They pointed at the wrong object. But what you can really tell here is that with directed pointing gestures, people remembered where they're supposed to point at. People really remembered that CNN is at the window and mute my stereo system is at the screen and turn on the lights is up there, for example, right? On that light. People really remembered that, whereas when people had to remember CNN is in the top right corner and mute my stereo system is in the center bottom and turn on the lights is at the bottom left, people really could not remember that. So, does the difference in the cognitive processes result in differences in selection accuracy, selection time, and learnability? Yes, it does, right? It absolutely does. And I believe that this answer, I mean, it's a kind of, you should say, well, that's really a small contribution, right? It's a contribution, but it's a very small field. What does it mean in the larger context of interacting with digital devices? I believe actually that this research kind of already hints that with all those different types of human, of gestures, of non-verbal communication, we really just tapped into a very small part of what is actually possible, right? I presented to you 6 different types of nonverbal communication. Current system uses only one of those 6. Now this is the second one. What about if we use the full range, right? And that is kind of the question, right? What can we do if we use the full range of gestures that we have available to interact with digital devices? So again, if we look at, because it's the Games Institute, right? So if we look at computer games and how we interact with entertainment system computer games, it is usually gestures don't play an important role. Let's put it like that, right? Keyboard and mice, we all use those, right? Controllers, yes, they are the predominant form of how we interact with games. We have touch screens, but again, the vocabulary of gestures that we use on touch screens is limited, right? It's usually, again, emblems, predominantly emblems, right? You might have swiping gesture, but then you have your shapes, right? You do squares, you do circles, and they all translate to a direct meaning, right? So those are all emblems. It's the same limited alphabet that we're using. Now, admittedly, there was a push a couple of years ago to use a slightly broader variety of gestures, right? To include more types of gestures into our gaming experience. And I admit most of those devices are not around anymore. But does it really mean that using gestures to interact with game systems failed? Well, maybe, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we just didn't try hard enough, right? Maybe it was the implementation. Well, it was definitely to some degree the implementation. It was also the way of how we played, right? We still played with screens. We still played in a pretty standard console or setup, right? It's a screen and a player, right? Now we look at virtual reality systems. We look at augmented reality systems. And I think there's a huge opportunity to use more gestures in those systems to interact with those systems, with games, right? So why not, for example, when we barter with merchants in that's Skyrim, right? Why don't we use gestures to do our bartering? Why do we have to use numbers and buttons and QuickTime events, right? Why don't we try gestures, and why don't we use, the nonverbal communication that we would use in the real world? Why don't we use that in digital systems, in gaming systems as well, right? Or for example, flirting in video games. It's multiple choice, right? So I guess it works, but is that the best we can do, right? Maybe we can use effect displays to flirt with NPCs instead of using joysticks, I guess. Maybe that is a way to make computer games more immersive and more engaging, right? So, but even outside of those kind of traditional forms, but there are of course opportunities outside of those traditional forms of video games, right? So, for example, in augmented or virtual reality systems, can we use gestures to interact with games, right? And there have been projects, Minecraft for the HoloLens, for example, where you use pointing gestures, to position blocks and to interact with the building blocks of Minecraft, right? But of course, we can take it a step further. I can say, well, how do I interact with a menu, for example? Well, in the HoloLens version of Minecraft, again, you have a traditional menu, but why can't we have a gesture-based menu, for example? And then, of course, you can think about other domains as well, right? So all of those games I talked about for now were classic games that were used for entertainment. But lots of games these days are not used for entertainment anymore, right? They're used for, or gamification is used for all kinds of applications, learning, behavior change, motivation, whatever, right? Games for health, it's this huge domain. So can we use gestures in those kind of applications, right? So if you look at, for example, games for health or gamification, then we'll see that a lot of games, a lot of applications use very basic forms of gamification, right? Of game design, right? They use traditionally badges and achievements. They use leaderboards. They use points, and this is kind of I want to say not the dark ages of gamification, but this is kind of, this was how gamification was done 10 years ago, right? So the question is, maybe we can use gestures or gestural input to make those non-entertainment games, to make those serious games engaging and entertaining. Without, as I said, make the games themselves entertaining and don't make them entertaining because of some sort of extrinsic motivational factor like leaderboards, right? And one domain where I'm currently trying to apply this is games for mindfulness and meditation. So leaderboards work very well when you're competing. Points work very well when you have something that you can measure directly, where you can clearly say, well, running 5 kilometers is better than running 4 kilometers. Running 10 days in a row or having a 10-day streak is something we want people to push for, so we give you an achievement, right? This is all. It works so well, those standard ways of gamification work so well because the domain really allows for it. But what about non-competitive exercises, right? Like meditation or mindfulness. You can't really measure, you can't say, well, your mindfulness level is, or meditation level is 4.5, yesterday was 4.6, so therefore you did better. This is not how our emotions work. This is not how our brain works, right? This might be how our body works, but that's not how our brain works. It's not that easily measurable. But so games that or the game that I want to create that helps people to, or that facilitates mindfulness, meditation, all of that, they have to use different principles. As I said, they have to use, or I believe they should use different types of input, multimodal input from mobile devices, for example, to motivate player. They can't use achievements, or I think it's not a good idea to use achievements, to use points to motivate players. I think it's really in the game mechanics where the motivation should come from. So I'm currently creating this this game, I guess, or a program, an app for a study, where I want to use kind of novel game mechanics in order to engage people, right? So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. So what happens in this game is that every now and then you are attacked by. So as you might be able to see, it's kind of Space Invaders meets Missile Commander. So you have incoming negative emotions that you have to defend yourself against, right? So you can defend yourself against by shooting your guilt emotion with, a compassion reaction, or with a mindfulness reaction, or sharing reaction. As I said, this is just a prototype. So wording might change, but the idea is kind of that you learn how to counteract certain negative emotions with certain positive emotions. However, every now and then, a boss monster comes in and you have a guilt attack, or an anxiety attack, or a jealousy attack, or whatever, right? Whatever people might have in real life. And now the question is, how do you defeat those monsters? How do you defeat those boss monsters? And the idea for me is to use multimodal input and to say, well, to defeat the anxiety monster, you have to do a breathing exercise, right? You put your, I hope that's not going to interfere with the microphone. You put your cell phone up against your chest, and you do a breathing exercise for, let's say, 1 minute. Of course, through accelerometers, I can detect if people are breathing, and through the breathing, through this exercise, people charge their boss cannon, or charge their weapon that can defeat the boss, right? And once people complete the exercise, they then defeat this boss and move on to the next level. And you can think of all kinds of different inputs that really haven't been used in games so far to add engaging gameplay to something that otherwise might not be as engaging, right? You can think about, well, you have to load your boss cannon by walking 5 kilometers. You have a depression attack, so maybe you should go for a walk. You charge your boss cannon through a 2-kilometer walk, for example. Or you have, for example, a self-doubt, an attack of self-doubt. So why not use the microphone on your cell phone, and you talk to your cell phone and say 5 times, I'm a great person. Why not use the camera as input device? Why not say, well, take pictures of something, right? In order to charge your boss cannon, take pictures of something blue. Take pictures of a flower that you find. Take pictures of a rabbit or a goose, right? Something that people would normally do in exercises, in anti-stress or in meditation exercises, right? But put that in the context of a game where it's not only used to make you feel better, but where it's also used within the game to fight a boss monster, for example. Alrighty, so that's kind of the end of my presentation. So I hope I was able to convince you that gesture interaction and gestures, I want to see gestures in this kind of broader way, are really useful to interact with digital systems, and that currently we're only tapping into a very small amount of the gestures that we are using. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Yes.
An initial comment, the final bit there about the anxiety monsters and
Yeah.
whatnot. I can't help but chuckle because it seems preposterous, but I love the idea. I'm curious to see where it's going to go.
I don't think it's preposterous. I have people who tell me, well, when they are feeling stressed, they go into the basement and stream. Why not make that a game mechanic, right? Exactly.
It seems preposterous.
Yes.
Like at first blush,
Yeah.
you're like Missile Command meets Space Invader, and then you're doing breathing exercises. What? But if you just stop and think for like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Huh. Maybe.
I think it totally makes sense. I know it's probably not obvious, but I think it really makes sense. And I think, well, depends on how well the game will be implemented, right? I think it really should work. Alrighty. So, thanks for your comment, and thanks to all the people in here and out there. And is coffee served?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks.
Okay.